that. Well, we have I think, a great speaker here today. He was asked to come to the state of Kansas and inherited as a budget director. They created that spot, I think, for him as budget director and comptroller. Inherited a $300 million deficit in government spending there, and in 3 years turned that to, I think it was maybe $500–600 million plus, so about $1 billion turnaround. You can correct me if I get all this wrong. And Forbes magazine referred to his 3-year tenure as just revolutionary. And of course I'm hoping that he can hook up with Kevin Stitt's campaign. And by the way, we have Chaz with us today. Chaz is with the Stitt campaign, and hopefully we can do here in Oklahoma with Governor Stitt what Steve Anderson started in 3 years in Kansas, and actually, and hopefully Governor Stitt will have the backbone to see it through all the way, and that we can turn this state around to a state of prosperity and not crying about budget deficits all the time and act like we don't know what we're doing. Steve Anderson is, by the way, the SEC had filed a lawsuit against the state of Kansas. I think that's why Dorothy left from The Wizard of Oz to escape that. I'm not sure, but it was Steve who fixed that problem and got them out of. That's why the state of Kansas is not in jail today. But he is the leading author of textbooks that talk about the relationship between federal government and state budgets. So it's a privilege to have Steve with us today, and I'm delighted to tell you that even though he has a CPA degree, a math and physics degree, and other degrees, he's a very interesting speaker. So he won't bore you, and you'll be more awake when he's finished than you started. So Steve, let's give Steve an OCPAC welcome. Use this or this, either one.
Okay, I'll use this one. Well, when I went up to Kansas is a little different than what good pastor's introduction. We actually had just ended the year with a negative ending balance, which is actually a constitution violation of $27.4 million. We were $500 million in the hole, budget-wise. It was a mess, and I didn't even know about the SEC indictment because there was a gag order. Now, I think the reason there was a gag order because the person who was named in it, Kathleen Sebelius, was HHS secretary at the time. So I suspect there was a little bit of politics there. So I couldn't know about that till I showed up, or I wouldn't have taken the job. In fact, the only reason I was actually appointed because I think I was the only person that had a plan that he talked to. When Sam called me, I didn't know Sam from Adam. He didn't know me either. He just heard about me. I'd done some work for the Charles Koch Network. And I'm not affiliated with the Koch Network any longer. I've separated myself from them because of their globalist viewpoint of tariffs. So, at any rate, when I went up, what I discovered was just what we've always known about government. You know, the facts are on our side as fiscal conservatives. We just don't know how to apply them. Now, when I showed up, for example, the great thing about Kansas is the strong executive power state. The governor appoints the cabinet secretaries who run the agency. So we had ability to do things that you have a hard time doing in other states. It allowed me to go in the agencies and actually control the spending. And you find out that things are that way because they must be that way. And that's one of the things you learn in math philosophy. The system we've created creates a bureaucracy that basically continues to try to reinforce itself. You know, and that's perfectly understandable. Think about it this way. You know, you have a job. Now, you want to keep that job. And the way the government servant system works is, if you want to keep that job, the best thing you can do is not do anything more than what the person before you did. Now, I know it is funny, isn't it? The incentives are all backwards. But when you think about it, the reason you do that is because the risk-return curve is flat. Now, let's say I do something great. For example, when Keating appointed me, part of why I was appointed as a contract letter was to look at the retirement system. Well, the mathematics of solving it were relatively simple. In 2 weeks, I had something done that took them 10 years to put in, but is now in place for OPERS. We actually have a defined contribution system for new government employees in the state, which I think is a great thing. It helps change part of the dynamics that created the bureaucracy, and where longevity is the key to government service. Now you can go in and leave and you still take your 401k, which is what it's a version of a DC plan. It's just like a 401k. You can take it with you now when you go. But I had that figured out in 2 weeks. In a private company, I'd had a corner office. What I got was a nice pat in the back from Governor Keating. That's how government works. So there was no incentive for him to do anything but the person before him did. So when I went in, I had roughly 220 employees when I started, 20 in my budget division and 200 in the accounting and the technology division. And what I could see right away was the demographics fit almost every state is this way. I've consulted with Christie, Perry, McDowell, a number of other states. And when you look at the demographics of the workforce, it's largely an older workforce. And there's a reason because of the way we've designed the bureaucracy, the way retirement's designed, the way the healthcare is. In the private sector, healthcare is valued at about 25 cents on the dollar. That's how much employees value it. So there's a little different dynamic going with the workforce. So understanding that demographic, what I told my employees was, okay, when somebody leaves, we're not going to replace them. And here's how it's going to work. If you can show me how you can divide up those chores that person was doing and do it as well or better, we'll take half the salary and spread it amongst those of you that are picking up the extra chores. Now, what I didn't tell them, and the part that I think made this so good for the taxpayer, is that the benefit load in Kansas is probably similar here, I haven't calculated it recently, was 34% of payroll. So the state got half salary as saving and that 34% of benefit savings. Well, a little less than that because there was a little bit of benefit increase on the employees when their salary went up, but it was roughly 30-some% you got in savings. So you got significant savings. Now what you also got was all of a sudden an energized workforce, because literally there are people retiring on a regular basis in state government because of the demographics. And certainly when I was announced, there were a number of people that retired immediately. There was an assumption that I breathed fire if they'd read anything that I'd written about government, because truly there is 10% waste, inefficiency, and fraud. But you can't find it from the outside. It's really hard. But who knows where the inefficiency at are the employees. And it's amazing, as we shrunk staff, those in my budget staff were all people who had at least a master's degree, and I had 2 doctorates working for me. They went from 20 to 13. And we improved services incredibly. And what's interesting is the indirect savings you got. I got $22,000 in savings just in rents by shrinking my office. The opportunities were everywhere. And since we desperately needed the money, I was having to get into revolving funds to be able to make payroll every month. That's how bad it was when we first came in. So, they allowed me to do a little more than typically you could do. And that's the thing about government you learn is that it's kind of like maintenance of buildings. If there's a crisis, we'll maintain it. We fix the roof when it leaks, really is the way it works. And that's the way they apply to everything. They never would have allowed me to do any of these things if it weren't a crisis. When they knew that payroll needed to be met, you'd be surprised how even, your government employees, they weren't paid to. And I will say that by the time we were done, and we were down to the 140, we had a really great workforce. I was very pleased with the sort of effort we were getting and the sort of things they were changing. And I think we could have continued to evolve. I think we'd eventually ended up with 100 or less. But now what happens is that, I think when I was introduced, didn't give me quite enough credit. There was $700 million in the bank. As soon as there was $700 million in the bank, the cash flow issues were fixed. Then the re-elect me part of staff took over. And so basically they said, okay, cut back on what you're doing. Let's go ahead and we've got to get in re-elect mode. Because I will tell you what an ending balance is to a politician. That's re-elect me money. And that's sad to say that, but I've been around this long enough to see it over and over. That when there's a crisis, they want to cut spending. When they've got plenty of money, they want to spend. And they want to spend it in their areas. And that's part of the problem that I've always thought that's been the issue for conservatives is, we disagree on what we ought to spend money on, but conservatives seem to want to spend as much as the liberals. And I find that a problem. Now, I've always thought that what we ought to do is every time we have excess, we should reduce the tax rate. I think that works, because I think you get a snowball effect. Now, and I do want to clarify, what happened in Kansas, when I left there was $700 million in the bank. We'd taken the unsecured line of credit from $950 million down to $200 million. You know, things were going well, but we had zero income tax got passed overnight. I told the governor we needed $1 billion in hand in the ending balance in order to handle that, because it could be handled. That's the amazing part. You could cut the income tax to zero here overnight. You could take it, and we could actually operate. We could do all the functions we do currently. However, the problem you run into is that it's just hard for them to continue to be tough. So what ended up happening, I left. They stopped putting their finger on things. You know, those of you that had businesses know how it is. You know, I've been in private business my whole life. You manage every day. Little things like, as you get to the end of a fiscal year, if you watched expenditures, I told my analysts, you contact every agency, and if I see any furniture being bought, any capital expenditures, we're going to put our foot down. Because what happens is they spend to their budget. You know, I forced carryover funds. That's part of how we got this $700 million. Now, the beauty of carryover funds, after 18 months when it's been appropriated, they can't touch it. It becomes ending balance. So by being able to keep my thumb on them, I was able to force that sort of behavior. Now, as you dig deeper into the books, and I was able to create an accounting system, which is what Forbes talked about. That was a shadow system. That basically, it watched what everybody did. And what it told me is what I already knew. And that is, where your real waste is at, it's not the line workers. The line workers in general are great at state. And I'll tell a little DHS story here in a bit. But the line workers in general are great. It's those appointees that end up filtering into middle and upper management and staying there as each regime comes and goes. They're the problem. They're not producing anything. You know, and those of you that have been in private business and have had a management information system in your business would know what I'm talking about. I basically just built an MIS system that went out and grabbed information out of the accounting system. And here's what you find out. You find out there's a bunch of people doing very little in middle management, and upper management hardly doing anything that produces anything at all. They have almost zero effect on outcomes, which leads me to DHS. DHS, you've seen what's happened here over the years. How the repeating story of child abuse. And if you go look at the structure of DHS, anybody that's, I cut my teeth as a forensic accountant. That's where I did most of my work in the CPA world. And when I look at the structure of DHS here in Kansas, anywhere I've looked at it, you can see the problem right away. They built what they call layers of deniability, plausible deniability. You know, every time we find an abused child, who is it that we go after? We go after the social worker. We've got low paid, not heavily trained, and with such turnover, they're usually a fairly new employee that is under all the pressure. Now, what I told Sam is an easy fix. A fix in the private sector we would immediately do. When you bring accountability, you'd be amazed how it changes outcomes. Now, what I told Sam is what we need to do, and I've written some pieces on this. If you go to Real Fiscal Conservatism in Government on Facebook, you see I've written a lot about this sort of stuff. But what I've always said you should do is, those who are in middle management, those desk jockeys that are supervising the social workers, make them go out once a week with that social worker to those cases that are problem cases. Now, once a month, make those at the very top go out to the worst of the worst. Now, what that does is that removes that layer of plausible deniability. If something goes wrong with that child, something bad happens, who's in the line of fire now? And you'd be amazed when you change plausible deniability and you wipe that off, everybody that's held accountable all of a sudden starts to pay attention. And you know, we've seen the DHS cycle over and over here. Now, we also have our issue with the Department of Health. And I want to talk a little more about Oklahoma than Kansas, if it's all right. Because I think we have a tremendous opportunity here in Oklahoma. You know, you can go and, as I was saying when I was comptroller in Kansas, I made them design a report out there that's down here too. It's not quite as good. But if you go to the Oklahoma Tax Commission. There's something called a tax expenditure report. If you really want to get your eyes open, I'll give you an example in Kansas when I first looked at it. The tax expenditure report, and it's a beautiful one up there. It's easy to follow, and fortunately being state comptroller, I designed it, so that's why I say it's easy to follow, because I designed it. Anyway, and what we should have got, if you really look, of taxes that should have flowed to us was $14.6 billion. What I had to spend was $6.07 billion. That much was taken off the top. Now what this reflected is, 1972, the income tax rate in Kansas was 2.75%. The sales tax was 2.5. When I walked in, the income tax was 7.25. The sales tax was 6.15. What happened was they kept giving it away. You know, and you'll see that when you go to the tax expenditure report here too. So in other words, if we've just wiped out all the exemptions, all the special exemptions that had accumulated over the years since 1972, we could have eliminated the income tax overnight and brought the sales tax down to about 3.25%. Overnight. You know, but the thing is, it's kind of an incremental thing. And the Democrats are really good at this. And we were talking about earlier, it's something when I've written about, I call it destructive incrementalism. You know, and I think conservatives, we need to have constructive incrementalism, where we know where the goalposts are at, and we keep moving toward it. You know, little things like I'm talking about bringing accountability. We'll move those goalposts, because I'll tell you what happens when you bring that accountability. Those people in middle management, upper management that are in a position to retire are going to retire almost immediately. I saw that when I took over the technology section in Kansas. The minute they knew I was coming in, we had mass retirement. You bring accountability, and people that aren't doing their job will leave, because they don't want to be in that line of fire. But back to the expenditure issue, on those tax expenditures, it's just that bad here too. Now remember when they said they were going to have a group look at all the exemptions? You remember that we had committees studying that? Well, they looked at them and they discovered what we discovered in Kansas. Every one of those has created its own political group. Now, one of the ones I wanted to go after was the sales tax exemptions, because that was $5.3 billion of those exemptions. Now, here's how they work, though, when you go after the sales tax exemptions. The big ones, they don't show up first. The corporations that are getting it, in Kansas, the farm machinery was a big one, also on the grain sales was a big one. But who comes in your office first are the Girl Scouts. I mean, who isn't a sucker for those chocolate-covered mint cookies? I mean, it's one of those exemptions that's hard to remove. Same with the VFW is in next. But those were only 21.6 million of the 5.3 billion. Now, do we have a rifle up here where I can shoot him? Or how does that?
Yeah. He's reaching for his phone.
He's getting his wallet out now.
I'm usually the one whose phone goes off, so. So they were a minuscule part of it, but when they come in, no politician can vote against those groups. And kind of what I told the legislators is they would call me and say, that's a terrible idea you had, Anderson, which meant one of many terrible ideas I had, but practical but terrible. So we'll go ahead and leave those in place. 21.6 million we can live with. Give me the 5 billion. That's what I really need. And so we can wipe out the income tax. Total revenues from it at that point was about 2.6 billion. So you see with that 5 billion, I wipe out the income tax, then go after corporate tax and still be able to cut sales tax to 3.25. But when they come in and do the soft, and when next in is Boeing, you know, the big boys start coming in, and they can throw some money around, it's almost impossible to win that fight. And that's why I say really constructive incrementalism is what we've got to work on. You know, the facts are on our side. As fiscal conservatives, we have to know where we want to go and move the ball toward that direction. The Democrats have understood this for a long time. The liberals are really good at this. I'll give you a good example. 1965, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is probably, to me, he's the great Satan of liberalism. He's the one that planted maintenance of effort. Most of you probably have no idea what maintenance of effort is. How many people have ever heard of maintenance of effort? It is probably the worst problem for state budgets. Medicaid is a maintenance of effort issue. Special ed is a maintenance of effort issue. 8% of the school budget is special ed, but yet the federal government has such control of our schools. Medicaid eats up about a third of your budget. When I walked into Kansas, a third of my budget was spent before I had budgeted $1. Because the feds have this maintenance of effort. Maintenance of effort basically says, you're going to spend what you spent last year in the way you spent it, or we're going to cut all the money off. Now consider that I haven't looked in a while to see what the total Medicaid budget is here. I'm guessing it's over $3 billion. That's about 50-50 state and federal money. Now remember, that federal money is money that goes to DC and bounces back to you. Under a constitutional republic, supposedly the state is supposed to collect and spend its own tax dollars. Now how is it that I'm able to not control that $1.5 billion that I'm required then to spend on Medicaid? Now it's a little trap. And Johnson was a brilliant man in his own way. So he brought Medicaid on the bill that was created in '65. If you want to see what Medicaid's done to this country, you need to look at a graph between Medicaid expenditures and unwed births. The correlation is alarming. What we did, we basically created an incentive not to get married. I've got a piece on there how to fix it too, a conservative version, but that's the thing why we've got to slowly do it. You can't kick the stool out all at once. Food stamps is another one. Most people don't realize Lyndon Johnson brought food stamps back. Now he brought it back, he was a brilliant politician. He understood the power that he could get with food stamps. Food stamps is in the ag program, in case you don't know. You probably think it's in the welfare program. No, it's in ag. And the beauty of it being in ag was that you get an unholy alliance of urban liberals and ag state conservatives voting for it. Because you get your subsidies for the ag industry is in the same bill that food stamps is in. So when everybody said, well, we're going to cut food stamps, no, you aren't. You're going to have a hell of a time doing that. Now, I do think that Trump had a great idea going back to the way food stamps arisen. I see some of us in here old enough to probably remember when the government cheese and peanut butter. It used to be it had to be a commodity. What the Democrats understood when Johnson put it in place was in that destructive incrementalism. If you watch how food stamps evolved, it didn't take very many years where they said, oh, you know what, prepared foods ought to be okay. We're going to allow prepared foods to be part of the food stamp. And then, oh, you know what, foreign products are probably okay. Now, if you look, I've put a pretty long piece on that over on that site, on my Real Fiscal Conservatism in Government site, that talks about how the food stamp evolved the point. You can get lobster now on it. It's a food product. But what's scarier about it, and this is the part where we get to the fraud, is it's hard to trade cheese for drugs. Hard to trade broccoli for drugs. It's pretty darn easy to trade a debit card. If we would go back to commodities, and for all of Trump's shortcomings in how he communicates, and my wife, who lived in New York City a number of years, who tells me that's just kind of the way New Yorkers are, he's had some brilliant ideas. The idea of bringing Blue Apron type approach to food stamps is really pretty brilliant. Now, it may cost us a little more initially per meal to deliver, but what it will do is eliminate those who are using that debit card for drugs. Now, I hate to just throw drugs out there because there's other uses. You can turn it into cash, 50 cents on the dollar, the sort of things you find when you start digging deep into it. For example, when I was working for Keating, one of my eye-openers was to find out that one of the big places for the use of our debit card was a convenience store in Guthrie. Now, how much sense does that make? As a forensic accountant, that screams fraud to me. But, nobody had ever looked at it. And I think there's more than 10% in that food stamp program. But they understood as they expanded it that they would create a voter base. And they've done that quite successfully. And we need to apply our own constructive incrementalism to try to pull that back. And I think Trump had a great first move with the Blue Apron approach. Send those boxes out to them. You might have to spend a little more initially, but in the long run, I think we're winners. And I think this is rampant in government as you look at things. Now, the 10%, as I said, it's sometimes hard to spot, but if we incentivize things right, the way I incentivized it with my employees in Kansas, you'd be surprised that bureaucracy is our friends. They're just people defending their jobs, you know, at the line worker level. Now, those political appointees, like I said, that's why I developed a shadow system, because they are the problem. You bring accountability to them, and next thing you know, you've got a lot less employees. And that's where you save big money, is at the top. I'm hoping that we have an outsider, and fortunately we have one of the top campaign people here, that we get that in Oklahoma, because Oklahoma, when he says we should be a top 10 economic state, he's right. There's huge potential here. You know, but you look at us, and we're acting with our oil and gas industry as much as we do with our ag industry. Now, if you look at our ag industry is largely third world crops. We do both crops. You know, we do wheat, corn, sorghum. Those are things that are all butting up against what in math we call 1 over X, the law of diminishing returns. How much more can you pump yield up? Because you know wheat prices have been about the same since they've been since the 70s. You know, it doesn't get much out of $5 wheat. We're still looking at, I think, 5 1/4 when I looked the other day. About the same it's always been. So we've been making up for it by just more and more production. But instead of going to, and this is one of those things that just makes you shake your head, Arkansas has 5 times as much high-value crops as we have. Those high-value crops are your vegetable crops, your melons, those sort of things. You know, does that make any sense? In fact, in surrounding states, all of them produce more than we produce. Our policies have not tried to incentivize that sort of behavior where we change and bring high-value crops. High-value crops is the savior for the rural areas. You know, Keating understood that. That's the only reason I'm kind of halfway cognizant on that, is I went out with Ron Voth, who was, I think, Deputy Director of the Ag, out to California when I was working for Keating to talk to the small producers out there about coming in. And they were interested. Their problem was there wasn't a 12-month growing season. Of course, there was an easy out. Sam actually proposed a north-south axis. South Dakota was on board with this. Texas was on board. Marion, her Commerce Secretary, never even contacted us back. When we talked about smoothing regulation, I don't know if you heard about the Rural Opportunity Zone that we put in Kansas, which meant if you moved in from out of state, for 5 years you didn't pay any income tax. And we designed it so it was on the individual income tax so it would flow through to LLCs, knowing that's the processors we'd be able to get. Dole and that will never come. But the smaller ones would come, those that wanted to brand. And I do most of the shopping because I do most of the cooking in our house. I like to cook. And if you go into the produce now, you see the branding taking place. You know, Vidalia onions was the kind of the predecessor of all the current branding. And you see the prices they get for it, and you understand that north-south axis, starting in South Dakota, going to Texas, would give us 12 months of growing season. It isolates E. coli and salmonella issues, and it also creates the opportunity to brand by each region where you grow. So this is something that can be done, but we've got the big one in our hand and we're squandering it, oil and gas. What do we do with our oil and gas? Heck, we don't even refine most of it in this state. We ship it out. Natural gas is huge for high-value crop producers. You know, when they do the freeze, when you fast freeze it, natural gas is the ideal. Why we don't have a, you know, many states here, I used to be in oil and gas. I wildcatted, had my own little company on the Kentucky-Tennessee border when I was a young man. Before I got married, I was allowed to take risks. And there, they hook right up to the wellhead. You know, why we don't allow that here? We don't allow the industry to buy right off the wellhead. There's opportunities. We need to encourage our oil and gas to be refined and used in this state instead of shipping it. Because the thing about natural resources is once they're used, they're gone. Someday, that oil is going to be gone. And if we haven't built industry around it, then we've made an awful error. We have cheated our grandkids and our great-grandkids. And that's why I'm excited about when I hear Stitt talk about a top 10 state. This could be a top 10 state. And it could be done, I think, relatively easily. The rural areas are begging for it. I mean, I don't know how many of you grew up rural, but I grew up in northwest Kansas. I go back and towns that used to be there aren't there anymore. And I hear farmers talking about how they can't keep family on the farm anymore because they actually have to expand acreage to be able to continue to have the same income that they've got. High value crops require more people, less acreage. You know, it's interesting to see the returns 4 to 5 times per acre, what it is for the bulk crops we grow. Now there's some issues with it, of course. There's weather. You never know, you get hailed out. But the beauty of it is you can usually plant a second crop of that. You know, broccoli grows in the spring and the fall here. I'm also a gardener. I've got lots of little issues. But anyway, so I do both of those myself. I know it can be done. And certainly when we went out and talked to little processors, they were interested in Oklahoma. You know, we're relatively cheap land. They knew the natural gas was here. They knew that our workers' comp rolls, because Keating had already started working on those, were good, that we were right to work state. They'll come. And that north-south axis is there waiting to be done. You know, the politicians in all those states would love to see it. Now, Nebraska excluded. There's something odd about Nebraska. It's the only socialist state, I think, along the north-south. And something about the way it was settled, I guess. But it's a little different. They didn't want to participate. And I don't know what Mary's reason was. But Texas certainly has a huge ag industry. Kansas has more than us. South Dakota has more than us. Now, how can that be that they have more high-value crops? But the oil and gas industry is the one that we are really losing out on. And I've always said one of the things we ought to attack first, even before individual tax, might be the corporate tax. However, I will say there is, if we eliminate the individual income tax, we might get the same benefit of keeping the headquarters of Devon here. Now, those of us who are a little older, remember, where did Conoco, where did Phillips, where did Kerr McGee start? Here. And I'll never forget, one of the things when I worked for Keating, you know, I'd been in private sector my whole life, and I foolishly let myself get talked into going to work in government. It's affected me financially ever since. And you know, I spent the first 6 months going, you're kidding me. Why are we doing things this way? But I guess before, you know, how much time do I have? I don't want to ramble off too much on this.
5 or 10 more minutes.
Okay. You know, when Keating talked about, you know, we want to improve the state, it was bringing more people to the state. He understood the thing that most of us haven't looked at. You ought to go to something called How Money Walks. If you're out there on the internet, if anybody's seen that site. My good friend Travis Brown did that. I think Tom Daxon worked it up for Keating. First time I ever saw that worked up. And part of it is because Tom was an old private sector CPA. The IRS does something they call IRS Migration Statistics, where a person files a tax return in 1 year, what their gross income is, and where they file it the next year. And he worked it up for Keating and showed him what was happening in the state. You know, Kansas the same way. Our greatest export is our educated youth and our well-to-do. You know, when you retire, how many of your friends have retired to Florida and Texas? I know it's my wife talks to me about it all the time. Said, you know, we could be on the south side of Texoma, you know, zero income tax. You know, it's there. We see the incentives, but back to the oil and gas. We lost all the good ones. Lou Corbett came when we were trying to keep him in town. And Tom Dax and I went to talk to him about incentives we could give him. And I think we showed up with $300 million of giveaways. And I hate to say as a conservative, there I was, with $300 million worth of giveaways. But Lou Corbett said something I think that really stuck with me. He said, when I cross the Red River, all of a sudden my employees get an over 7% pay increase. It's that income tax difference. He said, you can't compete with that with $1 billion payroll. So you think about that. We've got to attack the income taxes. If we want to keep Devon here, want to keep Chesapeake here, you know, you can go at it through the individual. I've always thought the corporate was the easier to bring corporate headquarters here, because the great thing about corporate headquarters, they are the high salary people. They're the ones you get a lot of income tax off, and we pay a lot of sales tax, pay a lot of property tax. But we haven't been good at explaining to the public why we want to reduce taxes. But I think if you go to How Money Walks, and you see that website, like I said, when Tom showed that to Keating, I mean, it opened his eyes. It's the same thing I showed Sam. And then Travis Brown, he and I got to talking at one of the ALEC meetings, one of the national meetings where we were both speaking. And I'll have to give it to Travis. He took it one step further. He went and contracted with the IRS to get 20 years worth of data, dumped into him, and he did a program now. You can click on any state, and it shows how much money's leaving your state and how much money's coming to your state. Now, when we did it for Kansas, and I just worked it up on my own for Sam, it's interesting the 5 states where it was going to. You know, Kansas was a net exporter. I can't remember off the top of my mind how many $1 billion we were exporting, but it was a tremendous amount. But it was going to the places you would suspect. Florida, Texas, Nevada, and the state of Washington was in the top. Now, Washington, you don't think about Washington as, oh, you know, warm weather, you know, good sandy beaches, but it is zero income tax. And that, I mean, that's the sort of facts you can't dispute. That people were taking their money, and it wasn't just the older retirees. No, it's because you build, when that wealth goes to a state, look at Texas. You know, Texas has always had no income tax. You know, forever. Now, what happened was, when all of a sudden state income taxes got high enough in other states to make a difference in people's income, that's when Texas got the big influx. You know, when California hit 10.75% for that top bracket, if you want to see a real change in how money walks, go look at that. And it's decided. You know, it's that old thing that comes down to everything when you talk about people is, in the long run, people will always act in their own best self-interest. Now, I realize that's a bell curve. Over here, there's 2.5% on either end that are the exception to that, but in general, that's the story. And certainly you watch the growth of Texas, and it is directly aligned with the growth of state income taxes in other states. You know, Austin is the weird place it is now because all those rich people moved there. You know, but we don't want to export our youth. We don't want to export our retirees. The way to deal with that, though, is to attack the income tax. And I think that you can do it the individual or you can do it corporate. They both will work. And they can be done. It's just having the wherewithal to do it. There's 2 ways to attack it. One is to go to that tax expenditure report and go after those exemptions. Now, if one were to do that, campaign manager for Kevin Stitt, you best do it the first year. And that was the discussion Sam and I had, is do the tough things the first year. It gives time for the ripples from that rock you threw in the pond to settle. If you don't, there'll be, and you see some of the chaos that Trump's facing with Republicans going into the midterm from all the tough things he's been doing. And I suspect he hasn't got that same counsel. You know, do some tough stuff, wait for the ripples to subside a little bit before you throw another rock. But certainly he's doing things I think that are good ideas. But you need to do them early on if you're going to do it. The other one is to cut spending and do something like Colorado did. You know, my good friend out there out in Colorado designed Tabor. Now, what Tabor was designed to do was realize that everybody that gets a check from the government appreciates it. The way Tabor was originally, are you all familiar with what Tabor is? Okay, there's a taxpayer bill of rights in Colorado that says they can only spend so much every year, and the excess then is returned as a check. Now, the beauty of that was in that, you know, I hate to have to buy politicians, but basically that's what it was doing. It was sending, if I voted for this, I'm in the House or Senate there, and you're in my district, and you got your annual check from Tabor, that's a re-elect me check. And he understood that was a powerful tool. That's how Tabor got passed. Now, they're not getting as big of checks. It has kept their tax rate down. And if you go to look at how money walks, check how they've changed since Tabor in Colorado. Now, the downside is that Colorado started to turn into a purple state on its way to a blue state because rich people from California moved out when they saw the advantages they had in taxes there. You know, when you're making $10 million, and the difference in the top tax rate is pretty significant. You know, my income bracket, not so big, but in theirs, it's a big incentive to move out. And plus, they had skiing, and it is pretty on the Front Range. But the Front Range has completely changed in my lifetime. largely driven by Tabor. And it is an interesting concept. It's one that one could use in order to do it. You know, and I do like the idea of controlled spending. That is a great way to bring your income tax rate down. In fact, if you look at our original tax plan in Kansas, if you go to my budget, that was my plan. It was a march to zero. It wasn't zero overnight. Zero overnight was one of those little political oddities where a bunch of moderate Republicans in the Senate loaded up our tax bill, took all the pay-fors out, loaded up, and I don't know if anybody's interested in political intrigue, but it's one of the great political intrigue stories I've ever been around. Loaded it up thinking that we wouldn't pass it in the House. Basically, the House had passed our plan. Sent it to the Senate took the pay-fors out and sent it back and turned it into a $1.9 billion cost. Now, the mistake they made was that we conservatives really do believe in cutting spending. So it went ahead and passed in the House. It was not without some, they have filibusters are allowed in Kansas. In the House, you're allowed to, if you make a vote, you're allowed to ask for the chair to give you a minute to explain your vote. Well, it turned out every one of the Democrats had had hip surgery, and it took them about 5 minutes to get to the podium, about 5 minutes to get back. The Senate is trying to amend the plan so that they can kill that bill, because if they make one more amendment, the bill as it stands is dead. So they're over there filibustering. Our guys are filibustering over in the Senate. We gavelled down about 5 minutes before our last senator ran out of his life story, because all the rest of them had already told him. And we ended up with zero income tax.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Everything is fine and dandy. How about the waste? The state has a lot of empty buildings, properties, and they use the taxpayers' money because you have to take care of it, you have to pay insurance, you got to pay the employees to take care of it. Why they don't rent it or sell the property?
Well,
That's my
you know,
question.
part of what they hold has got asbestos in it. Those storage units down there by the Capitol that they're using. But, and I'm glad you bring that up, because one of my big problems with government was government shouldn't own buildings. Capitol's fine to have your own capital, but the rest of the buildings, government doesn't need those. In fact, I had my analysts up there in Kansas call around all the counties that have been losing population, knowing that there were vacant buildings. He said, well, you know, can we get cheap or free space? 70-some counties offered us free space, including banks that had just closed that had T1 lines in. So we could have taken our square foot cost, all our rental costs, disseminated employees around the state on those clerical positions, which would buttress those rural communities that were suffering. You know, because you got to keep your hospital or school or you lose your community. Could buttress those up with those jobs. But surprisingly, when you start talking about moving employees out, it's really tough. You know, selling the buildings, and the other problem doing business with government is, and we as citizens are part of the problem, is when you do business as government, as I warned the governor, that, you know, we talked about selling our turnpike, for example, up there, turning it into private sector. Here's the problem, and it's what went wrong in Indiana. Mitch Daniels sold it for a huge dollar. Huge dollar. Now the problem was, it was such a huge dollar that the Spanish corporation that bought it couldn't manage it. And actually, it started deteriorating.
Is that Quintas?
Excuse me?
Was it Quintas that bought it?
Might have been. It was a Spanish company. But anyway, the turnpike went to heck. But if you're a politician negotiating a sale or contract, your incentive is you got to make what looks the best deal for the state. Otherwise, you're going to be attacked. Now, if you make the best deal for the state, you might not be putting together a contract, and Trump talks about this, that's a win-win. You really need a win-win. In private sector, that's what we do. If I've got a client that was selling their business on a owner finance, we want that business to continue to thrive so they can pay. But if we strike too tough a deal, then they probably can't make it. So we got to something that's a win-win for both. It doesn't work that way in politics. And we as conservatives have thrown rocks at politicians that we thought made a bad deal. We've got to, you know, and the liberals are terrible about it too, but we have our own guilt in it also, is we need to understand that they need to be deals that when we outsource, for example, I outsourced the Consolidated Annual Financial Report, part of the accounting up there I outsourced. When I outsourced, I saved $150,000. It cost me about $300,000 a year to put the capital. Saved $150,000. But believe me, they were throwing rocks at me. Well, couldn't you got a better deal? Well, maybe I could, but I wanted an outfit that was going to come in and do a good job, for one thing. And that would continue bidding on it. That it wouldn't be a one-year thing, because if I outsource it 1 year, the next year, all of a sudden, they don't want to do it, then my staff's already left. And there I am looking like a fool. So I've got to negotiate a deal. I could have probably negotiated them down to 100,000, but my gut was that they were going to lose money at that. And that, so there's a trap on some of these things. And pardon me for talking so long, but I could go on for hours about this stuff.